Time to take a look at Chapter 2 of Sun Tzu's Art of War. This one is titled Waging War. It deals mostly with logistics, but also makes important assumptions that might not be viable anymore. But first, let's find out what was written. The chapter starts off with an example army, and then notes that an important aspect of waging war is running costs. The interesting part is that Sun Tzu lists various costs one might not associate with military operations. When provisions are transported for 1,000 li, when there are expenditures at home and at the front, and stipends for entertainment of envoys and advisors, the cost of materials will amount to 1,000 pieces of gold a day. Since he lists costs like envoys and advisors, this clearly means he keeps the political entity like a kingdom or a state as an act of military actions in mind. Thus one could say he has a grand strategy approach. To put it rather simple, tactics wins skirmishes, operational art wins battles, strategy wins campaigns, and grand strategy wins wars. Based on the high costs of waging war, Sun Tzu comes to the following conclusion or assumption, namely that a speedy victory is the main object in war. Additionally, he notes that morale, weapons, and many other factors degrade steadily over extended periods of war. Thus he concludes that one must understand the evils inherent in employing troops, in order to use troops in the most effective way. To deal with the costs, Sun Tzu states that those that are able to wage war properly won't require additional recruitment or more than 2 provisions. Namely, the army should use captured provisions from the enemy's land. He expands that transportation of food and repairing equipment is usually what impoverishes a country during war. Thus he concludes on logistics. Hence a wise general sees to it that his troops feed on the enemy, for 1 song of the enemy's provision is equivalent to 20 of one's own, and 1 she of the enemy's father to 20 she of one's own. Additionally, he mentions the importance of loot and reward for soldiers, the capture and reuse of enemy equipment, and the proper treatment of prisoners of war. Now let's revisit and discuss those aspects mentioned and review them based on our current knowledge. The observation that logistics are a major burden on the state and the armed forces are still correct, and probably best underlined by a famous quote from a Marine Corps channel. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics. And by the way, logistics are everywhere. For instance, at the drawing board of weapons. This is something one can learn indirectly from computer games. For instance, if you played any flight simulator set in the World War II era, you might have noticed a huge difference in gun layouts among countries like the United States and Germany. The sheer amount of different aircraft calibers of the Luftwaffe is mind-boggling. And this doesn't even account for variations of these calibers. German bombers often had 2 or 3 different weapons mounted in one bomber, whereas US bombers, except for specialized variants, usually only use the 50 cals. In short, in regards to the importance of logistics, the chapter is still completely valid. But enough of logistics, let's look a bit further. Although Sun Tzu clearly is aware of the grand strategy in economics, he assumes implicitly that a short war is possible. Speedy victory is the main object in war. First off, a little reminder from the current United States Secretary of Defense, James Norman Mattis. No war is over until the enemy says it's over. We may think it over, we may declare it over, but in fact, the enemy gets a vote. Now I don't think Sun Tzu's statement is viable anymore, although it was for a very long time. Due to major changes in population density, infrastructure, technology and industrialization, total and long wars like the World Wars became a reality in which speedy victory was out of question. If we look at those wars, in the First World War all sides assumed a quick victory, but it turned out quite differently. And if we look at the Second World War, the Germans and Japanese were both trying to fight a short war but failed. Although they knew that they couldn't win a long war due to their initial resource situation. This doesn't mean that the short war strategy couldn't have worked at all, but it was rather unlikely, especially when fighting extensive powers like the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. Hence the question arises if the premise of a speedy victory nowadays might be more detrimental than beneficial. Of course, we can never rule out that those world wars were an anomaly in history and just existed for a short blink, although a heavy one. Yet the recent developments toward asymmetric warfare speak against the speedy victories for the upcoming years, which is also underlined by Mattis' quote. Now the next part is about using the enemy's provisions and equipment. If one looks at World War II, there's one country that did this extensively, namely Germany. The Wehrmacht captured a large amount of vehicles and weapons before and during the war. like the Czech Panzers that were redesignated by the Germans as Panzer 35T and 38T, or a large amount of Soviet anti-tank guns that were used for some variants of the Marder tank destroyer. Same goes with provisions. The Germans plundered a huge amount of food and other resources in the occupied territories, in some cases also with the intent to kill a major part of the population. Yet mass-produced equipment can't be easily adapted and maintained as spears, swords, and other pre-modern equipment. I assume most artisans could repair equipment and weapons produced by their peers, but I doubt a regular tank mechanic can repair a foreign tank as easily, and even if he could, he would also need the spare parts. This was less of a problem with the Czech tanks, since the factories were integrated in the German war industry, but with other weapons and equipment this was often not the case. When it comes to taking provisions from the enemy or his population, this often will lead to famine. And it is also a war crime. Additionally, the chances of the population engaging in irregular warfare will substantially increase. This means that Sun Tzu's statement, "Hence a wise general sees to it that his troops feed on the enemy," is generally not viable anymore, or at least certainly diminished, either for logistical and/or moral reasons, at least when it comes to conventional warfare. In case of guerrilla warfare, it seems still viable due to the far smaller amount of forces engaged. In summary, the grand strategy approach of looking at war from a political viewpoint that also includes diplomacy and economics is still viable, as is the general notion of the importance and cost of logistics. Yet due to the industrialization and other modern changes, the approach of a short war is usually not possible anymore. Additionally, the usefulness and consequence of plundering or reusing enemy provisions and equipment has decreased substantially in effectiveness and might even be detrimental due to logistics, morality, and international law. Although the later two probably should be called public relations, because the majority doesn't seem to care about long-term effects, analysis, statistics, and laws, but more about emotional images. As always, all sources are in the description, as are the links to Facebook and Twitter. If you liked this video, you might want to take a look at the previous video on the Sun Tzu series, or maybe a simple model on how wars are won and lost. Anyway, thank you for watching and see you next time.